Hello and welcome to the dungeon. I'm your host Rob, and today we're going to be looking at the Valor Bard. And this is going to be a continuation of our series we started with the Champion Fighter, and it's going to be kind of along the same similar lines. The goal is to take a look at a class that most people online have widely panned and decide kind of sucks, and to decide if maybe they have some points, how we can avoid any of the traps or pitfalls that might arise from playing that class, and also how we can really make the best of it and try to really maximize the class's potential. I think, though, that with the Valor Bard, a lot of the criticism comes from the fact, not necessarily that the Valor Bard isn't good, but it's just that the College of Lore Bard is so good that it makes all the other Bard choices look kind of weak in comparison. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today will probably also apply to, say, the College of Blades, but I'm going to work my way through the classes in the Player's Handbook, then we'll go to Sword Coast Adventures Guide, then we'll go to Xanatars. So there will be a video in the future discussing the College of Blades, and that'll be separate, but a lot of this might apply to both. I think that the main criticism I see is just that getting a second attack around isn't that great of an ability, since the Bard has nothing else to really boost the power of that attack. And there's a lot of truth to this. When you look at the spell list, Bards don't really get a lot of good self buffs, at least not from melee. They don't have things like haste. They don't have things like Crusader's Mantle to help buff the party. One of the common Valor Bard builds I see is the Swiftquiver build. And frankly, I'm not really convinced that that one's great either, but I at least understand why someone would pick it. We'll talk about that more later. But in general, if you have, let's say, 16 dexterity, then stabbing someone with a rapier for 1d8 plus 3 isn't really that good, and stabbing them twice for 1d8 plus 3 each time isn't necessarily good either. It's important to remember, though, that the Valor Bard is really getting medium armor and a shield. They're still getting magical secrets, just not as many as the College of Lore does. And you also have the option of being in melee, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing to have on a character. Bards do kind of have that jack of all trades thing going for them. And in that case, how can you call yourself a jack of all trades if you can't even stab something with a sword every now and then? I don't know necessarily, though, that all this is enough to really make it as good as, say, the Lore Bard is, but I don't necessarily think it's as bad as people online make it sound either. So let's take a quick look at the overview of the class. At level 3, you're going to get medium armor and a shield and all martial weapons. And really, medium armor and a shield is a pretty good thing to have on a caster like a Bard. Especially among the arcane casters, none of them are going to have anywhere near that armor class. Let's say by the time you're level 6 and get your second attack, you're wearing half plate armor with a shield and have 14 or 16 dex or so. You're going to have 19 armor class already. I mean, a straight up Lore Bard is probably looking at about 14 with those same stats. So you essentially have a permanent shield spell at all times compared to a Lore Bard. And I think that if you start to look at the class as, I'm still going to be a caster, I'm not really a melee guy, I don't have a third attack around like a fighter or a fourth attack at level 20 like a fighter, I don't have smites like a paladin, I don't have reckless attack like a barbarian to help me land my hits, and I don't have rage bonuses that increase as I level up, I don't have all the extra abilities that a ranger has like Colossus Slayer or Horde Breaker or any of those things that are going to allow me to be better. I don't have things like Hunter's Mark to buff my damage. All I have is just 2 basic attacks. And that's not necessarily bad. There are situations where you might want to make just basic attacks. For example, at higher levels, you start fighting a lot of things with magic resistance. Like most demons and devils have magic resistance, giving them advantage on all saving throws. You also fight things with legendary resistances. And I see people talk about how they want to burn through somebody's legendary resistances, but I actually think this is just a terrible strategy. At least in any of the games I've been in, it's never really worked out. If you're hoping that the creature is going to fail 3 saving throws and then burn through its 3 legendary resists so that you can land some other spell on it that's going to be effective, then usually by the time you've had enough time to do all that, your fighter and barbarian and paladin have already managed to chew through all its hit points anyways, and the creature is probably dead or had to flee. So this idea that if I just cast enough spells, even with legendary resists, sooner or later it's going to fail and I'll have to use a legendary resist. And if that happens enough, then I can land my real spell. It's just a poor strategy. And so having a second attack around where you could run in and melee these kind of creatures is going to be more effective than trying to land a spell that's probably not going to do anything at all. I also think that if you build for support, then having basically a buffer and a debuffer and a healer, because bards are flexible and can do pretty much anything, then having that character with heavy or with a heavier armor class, I'll say that, like 19 or 20 armor class, is going to be a lot more effective because you're not getting hit as much, you're not going to have to make as many constitution saving throws, you're not going to lose concentration on your big spells, and so it's just going to be a lot better in general. I also think that we're going to see a common theme emerge with a lot of the classes that people complain about online, such as the War Cleric. Blade Locks used to get a lot of hate. It's not as bad now because the Hexblade is out, but even still, I see Blade Locks get a lot of people who just think that they're not very effective. And I think in every case, it's because someone wants to take what makes the class different, such as having extra melee attacks and getting to wear different armor, and then they want to build everything around that. And I think that's kind of a flawed concept. Like, lore bards don't say, I get 2 extra magical secrets at level 6, so I'm going to build my entire character around those 2 spells that I get to take from some other spell school. And those 2 spells are going to be the focus of my entire character. Nobody does that. But when they play a Valor Bard, they're like, oh, I get a second attack, so I'm going to take all my magical secrets to make myself better in melee combat. I'm going to take haste. I'm going to take Swiftquiver. I'm going to take all these other things to make myself better in melee. And at the end, you basically end up with like a substandard Paladin or Ranger at the end of the day, in which case you could have just ridden Paladin or Ranger on your character. People forget that you're still a full caster who can eventually have 9th level spells, and who now also has the option of doing a bit of melee damage. And if you think about it from the terms of, am I going to do more damage with a cantrip versus more damage with an attack, then the Valor Bard starts to look a lot more attractive. Because honestly, if you had some other spell you needed to be casting, like say a hold person or a hypnotic pattern or something along those lines, then you need to be casting that anyways, not running into combat to stab somebody with a rapier a couple times. So if you have something to cast, that should be your primary job. You are still a full caster as a bard. And trying to turn yourself into a full melee character who will also have 9th level spells will basically never work. The game is just not designed that way. There's a reason that Paladins got smites and you didn't. There's a reason that fighters got a 3rd and a 4th attack around, and that they got increased crit range, or they have superiority dice and maneuvers, allowing them to do more damage or to gain more flexibility in combat and fill more different roles. The Bard was not meant to do those roles, and trying to take all your magical secrets in order to fit yourself into that role is just going to lead to frustration, which is where I think a lot of the hatred for not hatred, but a lot of the venom, let's call it, towards the Valor Bard comes from. Because people are trying to do that. They take everything they have, try to fit it all in, and shoehorn a character into a role that it was kind of meant to be a support melee character, not a full-on, straight-up bruiser or brute that the fighter and the barbarian were meant to be. So I think that it really falls into a trap where people want to make it something it was never meant to be and try to put everything into doing that. And that's where the frustration comes from. I want to talk a bit about the different races for Bard, because there's some really, really strong choices. And it's worth noting that you can go as a Strength Bard or a Dex Bard, and that either one have advantages and disadvantages. For Strength, the advantage is that you could actually wear heavy armor and you can start taking feats like, say, Polearm Mastery or Great Weapon Mastery. And so if you really are committed to being good at melee combat, you can actually become somewhat decent. However, I think this can be kind of a trap too, because it falls into that same category as using all your magical secrets to make yourself better. Now you're using all your feats to make yourself better. A paladin or a fighter with those same feats is simply just going to be better at melee than you are. But as long as you understand that and say, well, I'll be alright and I'll still have spells, then I think you can be somewhat satisfied with it. The advantages of the strength is that dexterity is going to cap out at a +2 to someone's armor class if they're wearing medium armor anyways. And so with the strength build, it means you'll be getting the full attack and damage bonuses from strength, while also being able to wear heavier armor if you take the heavy armor feat, or if you start as something like, say, a paladin, which we'll talk about in multi-classing. But starting as a paladin or fighter would allow you to wear heavy armor right off the bat, and then you just go strength and charisma from there. The advantage of the dex build is that dexterity in general is just a way better stat in 5th edition than strength is. Strength really just lets you use heavy weapons and wear heavy armor. Whereas, I mean, sure, it helps with athletics and other things like that, of course, as well, and grappling. But in general, dexterity has way more saving throws attached to it than strength does. It gives you bonuses to your initiative. It gives you bonuses to your armor class. It can be used instead of strength if you're using a finesse weapon for your 2 hidden damage. It's good with missile weapons like bows and crossbows. Basically, dex is just a really flexible statistic, and it's just going to be a lot higher value than strength in general. That's not saying that you should never make strength-based characters. I'm just saying that between the two of them, dexterity itself is probably the more useful stat. But if you're wearing medium armor, unless you start taking feats, your dex bonus is going to cap out at a +2. And that means that even if you go to a 20 dexterity, you're capped out at your +2 from your dexterity. You've got your medium armor, which isn't as good as heavy armor, and the shield, but you could have worn a shield with heavy armor as well. So your armor class isn't going to be as good. And if you invest more into dexterity, it does have a lot more diminishing returns than what strength would in this case. That being said, though, I think the dexterity still remains a pretty viable option, and it doesn't require you to, say, multi-class like heavy armor would. You might want to use a feat, in which case that's a tie either way, because heavy armor would require you to use a feat. Taking medium armor master is also going to require a feat, of course. But with the dexterity builds, I don't necessarily know that you need to take that feat. As I said before, you could be a support guy and just live with the fact that you're going to be capped out at +2 dex. Maybe you take your dex to 16 or so, or 18. You don't have to really feel like you need to max it, because you're still primarily a caster. And when you melee, it's just because you had nothing more important to cast. So as far as strength races go, I think Dragonborn is obviously an excellent choice. Variant Human is just a strong choice for either one, of course. And I also like the Aasimar from Volo's Guide to Monsters if you're using the Volo's races. There's also a Tiefling bloodline from Zerial if you're using Mordenkainen's, and it gets +1 to its strength instead of +1 to its intelligence, while still having the +2 charisma bonus, and has some pretty nice spells. You can get a couple smite spells. So if you're really going to be committed to, I'm going to be a melee bard who's going to do a lot of damage in melee combat, that might be one of your best options right there. For Dex, of course, Variant Human still remains a strong choice. Half-Elf is probably good for either one, because you can put the +1s to whichever stats you want, and of course still get the +2 to your charisma. Drow-Elves are actually an excellent choice. For, Lightfoot Halfling. Standard Tiefling with +2 to charisma is always pretty solid. +1 to int is sort of a waste, because that's generally going to be dump stat. But again, if you're using Mordenkainen's, Glacia subrace has a +1 dex instead of int, and Levistus has +1 con instead of int. And both of them also have their own spells, which can be pretty nice as well. Levistus can give you Armor of Agathis as a 2nd level cast, for example, which isn't too bad. again, from Volos, if you're going with a Yuan-Ti Pure Blood, they have excellent stats. I don't know why emotionless reptiles are such good music makers, apparently, but Yuan-Ti is a pretty strong choice if you're using Volo monster guides. As far as the actual builds themselves, one of my favorites for the Valor Bard is the support melee build. And I call it a support melee build because it really shines in build or in compositions that have a lot of other melee characters. So let's say, for example, your party has a fighter and a paladin, and then your bard and maybe a wizard or someone as well to just round things out. You figure between the bard and the paladin, they can do the heals. The paladin and the fighter can be the front line, the tank. The wizard and the bard can both be crowd control, and the wizard and bard both have a lot of utility as well. The wizard has ritual magic, the bard can cast ritual spells as well. And between the four characters, you have enough overlap that everyone can do multiple jobs, and so no one really has to be super specialized. And this is where the Valor Bard can be quite nice. You can take magical secrets for things like Crusader's Mantle, which allow you to then buff up all the other characters in melee, and now everyone's going to be doing an extra die 4 radiant damage per hit. So if your fighter is making 3 attacks a round, let's say at level 11, he's getting an extra 3 die 4 per round. The paladin's doing an extra 2 die 4 per round. You could be doing an extra 2 die 4. And if the wizard is, say, a necromancer with a bunch of summons, each of those summons could be doing extra radiant damage. This goes with conjurations. You could use it with things like summon demons. You can use it with things like animate objects and just have a bunch of small or tiny objects all doing an extra bonus die 4 each from Crusader's Mantle. And I think that is an excellent choice for a magical secret in these types of compositions. Haste is also a good choice for here. I don't mind the idea of picking up things like Aura of Vitality as well from Paladin. And it's worth remembering that since your bard doesn't have magical secrets until level 10, you can take 5th or lower level spells from any of the different trees. I do see people try to combine this with things like Lightning Lure, Cantrip, or Booming Blade and Green Flame Blade, especially when you hit level 14. Your bard gets Battle Magic, allowing him to cast a spell and then use his bonus action to make an attack as well. But I just don't really think that this is a worthwhile combination. I really hate the idea of using magical secrets on cantrips, especially on the Valor Bard. You're not getting magical secrets until level 10, and using something that could have been a 4th or 5th level spell on a cantrip just seems like kind of a waste to me. I don't mind the idea of Summon Greater Demon on this type of character as well, because you can actually take expertise on Persuasion, and since it's Persuasion rolls to try to keep the thing in check, you will pretty much be able to control it better than an actual wizard would have been, which is kind of nice as well. There's also some great utility spells that you can choose in these kind of builds as well, since you're going more of a support character. Things like Wall of Force, Counterspell to help the wizard out, or if your party doesn't even have a wizard, then Counterspell becomes very important. And with higher level magical secrets, things like Contingency, Heal, even Mass Heal all become strong choices. And of course at 18, there's always the Wish spell, which is the most powerful spell in the entire game due to its flexibility. I'm going to talk about Wish more in an upcoming video. I'm going to make videos talk about all the different spell ranks and just kind of which spells I think are really good, which spells I think are not so good, and videos along that line. But it blows my mind when I see people say that they kind of feel like Wish is overrated because a lot of times it just never gets used. But there's so many good out-of-combat spells you could be using Wishes for that if you're just saving it for a disaster or an emergency and then not casting it when that doesn't happen, you're just wasting its potential. There's no reason you couldn't go through an adventuring day, get to the end of the day, and say, well, I didn't use Wish, so I'm just going to use it now and cast Demiplane, and we can store all of our extra stuff in the Demiplane. And then over the course of time, when you don't use Wishes, you can use your Wishes to clone all the party members and store your clones in your Demiplane. And then if you ever have a wipe, Well, now you've all got a bunch of clones, and all your backup gear is in the demi-plane with your clones. So at least now the party's not completely gone. You could also use wishes for things like Simulacrum, which is an amazing spell when you use it with a wish, because now you don't have to worry about material components, you don't have to worry about the casting time, any of that. And it's way more powerful than pretty much any summons you're going to be able to cast, because you can literally just make a duplicate of one of your party members, but with half health. And sure, it doesn't heal, it doesn't recover spell slots, but if you, say, Simulacrumed the Arcane Archer or the Ranger, then you don't really care. It's just going to be a ranged damage dealer with tons of attacks around, dealing tons of range damage, who's not getting hit very often. And if you can't keep casting, Hunter's Mark or Pass Without Trace because he used them all, that's fine too. You don't really need him for his spells in that case. You're using him more as just a damage summons, I guess you can call it. Of course, you can always Simulacrum yourself, and in which case you now have two of you, but I don't necessarily think that yourself is the best option, because you are a primary caster. You're not going to be able to get the spells back on the Simulacrum. But we'll discuss all that kind of stuff more in different videos. I just kind of wanted to throw out some different ideas for wishes and for magical secrets, which are just really strong pickups in general for the Bard. When it comes to overall, I think that the Valor Bard really starts to shine when you don't treat it as a primary melee character. You treat him as a primary caster who also has the option of going into melee. But like I said before, if you have important spells you need to be casting, those should be your first priority anyways, not stabbing someone with your sword or hitting them with a polearm. That's almost always going to be better left to the fighters and the barbarians and the rangers and the paladins. Any of the martial classes are just going to outperform you in that regard. And that's okay. It just is what it is. So as far as other builds, I do like, I promised to talk about the Swiftquiver build. Like I said, I'm not really a huge fan of this one, but I'll tell you what it is anyways in case you want to try it. The basic idea is that you get your second attack around at level 6, which doesn't have to be melee. It could be with a bow. You take Swiftquiver as one of your magical secrets, the 5th level ranger spell. Swiftquiver gives you the ability to fire 2 arrows around as a bonus action. So you can make your 2 primary attacks with your bow, then 2 more attacks as bonus actions. It actually makes you a pretty good archer, and if you combine it with things like, say, Sharpshooter, you can do a lot of damage. My problem with it, though, is that prior to getting Swiftquiver, you're just a substandard archer. You don't have the archery fighting style. You don't really have things like Hunter's Mark. You don't have Horde Breaker. You don't have things like Volley that the Ranger has access to. You don't really have any of the special abilities that the Arcane Archer has available to them. Basically, you're just a crappy archer who doesn't have the archery and doesn't have anything to make them better at it. Just kind of how you're a crappy melee character who doesn't have anything to make them better at melee. And when you start trying to take things like Swiftquiver and build your entire build around it, at higher levels it can function fairly well, but it means you're going to have to use all your 5th and probably 6th level spell slots to just keep casting Swiftquiver every time you have a fight in order to do something that the Ranger or especially an Arcane Archer is just going to have 3 attacks around at level 11 anyways, and doesn't have to rely on a spell to do it. As far as other builds that I do like, I think some good multi-class ideas are combining this with Paladin or Hexblade. And the Hexblade is pretty nice because you can just start as a Hexblade for 1 level and then just go Valor Bard. And the Hexblade is going to make it so that you can use Charisma as your attacking stat instead of Strength or Dex. And so the problems we discussed before are pretty much eliminated because now you only have 1 stat that you need to concentrate on, and it happens to be your prime casting stat. Also, it's going to give you things like the Hexblade Curse and whatnot, which are some pretty nice little abilities. It'll give you spells that you can use with your short rest from the Hexblade as well. You can pick up something like Shield. I don't actually like Shield much on a Hexblade because there's pack magic all scales automatically. So once you're like 8th or 9th, 10th level, you can't choose to cast shield as a Hexblade and with a first level spell slot. It has to be with whatever your highest level spell slot is. But if you only have 1 or 2 levels of Hexblade, that's not really a problem. You can use shield as shield, and you can get it back on a short rest, and you can use your bard spells with it. So it gives you some nice options. You can pick up something like Armor of Agathis, which becomes a pretty nice buff, especially if you start casting that with higher level spell slots. And so I think that that one's actually a pretty solid build, and it's not a very heavy commitment either. You can also pick up some decent cantrips. Obviously, Eldritch Blast is always a good option, and you could take something like Green Flame Blade or Booming Blade as well. If you then later wanted to get back into Hexblade for a second level, you could take something like Agonizing Blast, Invocation to up the damage on your Eldritch Blast, and you'd still be able to get to 18th level, allowing you to take Magical Secrets and get something like Wish and whatever other magic secret you take. So I think those are both pretty solid choices there. Either the 1 level Hexblade or eventually a 2nd level Hexblade. I don't think I'd take the 2 Hexblade right away, because you're already going to be getting second attack at level 6 on a Valor Bard, so it's going to be level 7 since you started with Hexblade for 1 level. So you're going to be getting it pretty late as it is. Obviously things like Green Flame Blade and Booming Blade can help to make up for a bit of missing damage, because you'll have a couple levels there where they're doing the extra die 8 on hit. But overall, it does mean that you're going to be slowing down all your other progression. Another option, though, is to take 2 levels of Paladin. And if you start with 2 levels of Paladin, this also means you're going to be getting second attack pretty late. It also means you're not going to have Green Flame Blade or Booming Blade or anything like that to help cover the difference. You're just going to be getting there slower. But that might not necessarily be bad. The things you'll gain from Paladin is that you can wear heavy armor, which is pretty decent because you're not going to get that from the Valor Bard. And more importantly, you can use smites, which actually does up your melee damage quite considerably. You can use any of your spell slots from the Bard class as smites. Obviously, going past level 4 is probably kind of pointless because your smites cap out at 5 die 8, but it does give you a lot more options. And it gives you a chance to pick up a couple of Paladin spells, which isn't necessarily a bad thing either. A thing I really like about this build is that it actually does allow you to be a pretty decent melee fighter now. You can wear heavy armor, use a shield, have even better armor class than what the Valor Bard would have normally had, and then combine it with some smites for some decent damage. I think no matter how you go with a Valor Bard, I want to talk about feats a little bit. And there's some real standouts for the Valor Bard. I think that taking something like Inspirational Leader is going to be pretty good on any Bard because you're a Charisma caster, and especially if you're building for more of a support Bard anyway, then giving your party a bunch of temporary hit points is always going to be great. Warcaster, if you plan on being in melee, is almost a must. You're going to need either Warcaster or Resilient Con. Resilient Con is going to be better at high levels. Warcaster is going to be better at lower levels. But Warcaster is also going to be important because if you want to cast spells while wearing a sword and shield, and those spells have a somatic component, you either need to just stow your weapon and then try to cast a spell, in which case you no longer have your weapon out, or you need Warcaster. So given that Warcaster is just going to give you more flexibility in general, I really think that it's almost a must-have if you plan on being in melee combat a lot. Other strong choices, of course, are always things like Alert and Lucky, which are just great for any build almost because they're just applied to essentially everything. And as I mentioned before, depending on how you want to go with armor, you might want something like Medium Armor Mastery or Heavy Armor Proficiency. And I think that you could even combine it with some of the more melee focused ones. Like if you want strength, you could take Polearm Mastery or Great Weapon Mastery. But I don't necessarily think that those are going to be strong choices because, as I said before, your attacks really just aren't scaling up, and all this is going to do is spend a bunch of your feats trying to do something that other classes are just going to do better. If you wanted to be a Paladin, you should have just wrote Paladin on the top of your character sheet and not wrote Bard. And I think by trying to force yourself to essentially be a Paladin, you're just always going to be frustrated that the class just isn't performing the way you wanted it to. So that's basically everything I had to say. I'm sure I've probably forgotten or missed some stuff. Unlike the Champion Fighter, which I've actually played to 20, I've never played a Valor Bard past level 3 or 4, I think, so far. So this one's a lot more theory crafting and less actual played experience. So, as always, these are just my opinions. Feel free to like them or dislike them. That's up to you. Hopefully there's something in here that you kind of liked, though, and something that you might be able to take away from it. I'm also planning on doing, my next video is probably going to be about the War Cleric, and since I haven't played a War Cleric to high level at all, I'm going to actually be doing it with a friend of mine who played a War Cleric to 18th level in one of our campaigns and had quite a bit of experience with it. And so hopefully it'll be like a collaborative effort and we'll just sit around and talk about War Cleric, and hopefully it'll be pretty good. So that's basically everything I had for this. I'm also planning on doing a series of videos, like I said, examining different spells of all the different levels. We'll probably just go by class. I might even just do, say, like Bard cantrips to level 4 and then like level 5 to level 9 in a separate video or something. And we'll just talk briefly about the standouts, what are the, good choices, bad choices, overrated, underrated, that kind of thing. And of course, we'll also continue with the DM series as well. So, a lot of videos in the future. Please feel free to like and subscribe. Don't be afraid to share the videos with others. And we'll see you next time in the dungeon. Thank you. Another thing you can do with the Wish spell before you camp is to simply use it for something like Mordenkainen's Magnificent Mansion. I mean, you're an 18th level Bard, for crying out loud. You shouldn't be sleeping on the ground like a hobo. You should be sleeping in a magical mansion. So if you're just going to let your wish spell go to waste by not using it anyways, use it on something like that. At least have some self-respect, man. Come on.